This is Athens Speakout, the 5th of December, 2017, 12-0517. It's called Progress During the American Revolution, which broke out in 1775 and lasted until 1796, when George Washington retired from his presidency after 2 terms. The American Revolution dovetailed in with the French Revolution, and the French Revolution broke out in 1789, the very year that the 10 Amendments were ratified, the Bill of Rights. And the U.S. Constitution was ratified at that time, and I said this was 217. I think it's 219. I think I got my numbers mixed up somehow or other.
419.
419, yeah. 419. I think I said 219. Is that right? Anyway, it's 419. All right. So this topic is very controversial because of the controversial words about the meaning of democracy. A Republican, a conservative, a liberal, progress, and the American democracy progressed from 1789 to 1945. And then we have the new concept of democratic socialism, which began in Europe in the 1870s and only reached the United States in 1917 in a very small form, because the United States was basically a laissez-faire capitalist country and resisted the very idea of socialism. So these 6 concepts are democracy, Republicans, conservatives, liberals, progressives, and democratic socialism. 6 different terms. And from my point of view, Steve Andel, Dave DeWitt, or my wife Lois can feel free to interrupt and debate the meaning of these terms. They're all controversial. So politics is not the same thing as legal thinking. And military thinking is different than economic thinking. So we have then 4 squares, and then the first 3 are relatively simple: politics, the military, and economics. And the 4th square is the most controversial. We have subgroups: philosophy, religion, ideology, and thinking. And that's where the big debates are in the 20th century. And looking now at the collapse of democratic thinking under Donald Trump, it looks like democracy is beginning to decline or decay. And that's going to be where the progress for democracy can continue. So I begin this talk with a slogan: presidential dealers. Teddy Roosevelt proclaimed the Square Deal. Franklin Roosevelt promoted the New Deal. Harry Truman promoted the Fair Deal. And Donald Trump promotes the Bad Deal. And we're both critics of Donald Trump. But Donald Trump could win this next election, and that would be tragic. In my opinion, the American Revolution should be called the War of Independence. It began in Boston in April of 1975, and it came to an end in 1781 when George Washington won the Battle of Yorktown and forced General Cornwallis to cried defeat, and that led King George III to recognize the independence of the United States in 1783. Then it was a long period of critical thinking. It took time to draft the American Constitution, and it was finally ratified in 1789. And we have a union of 13 states, and the federal Constitution, Article 1, is the powers of the Congress. And the Congress has two houses. Each state has 2 senators, all equal at the senatorial level. And in the House of Representatives, the large states have more votes in the Electoral College, and that's based on the size of the population of the state. In 1789, Virginia had the largest population of the 13 colonies, and they were granted 16 electoral votes and 16 seats in the House of Representatives. New York and Pennsylvania were more or less tied with 10 electoral votes and 10 seats each in the House of Representatives. And Massachusetts was a very important state intellectually, but they only got 10 votes in the Electoral College. The senators were elected for 6 years, the president for 4 years, or he could run again for 8. And the House of Representatives had 2 terms, and the voters, if they changed their mind, could throw the incumbents out and elect a new party. The legislature has to have 2 houses staggered over terms in order to keep the American government sovereign, and the sovereignty is divided in the United States. And that is the basic difference between a parliamentary system in France and in England, where there's a unitary government, and the Prime Minister also sits in the House of Commons, and the legislative branch and the executive branch are combined. The American Constitution, along with the German Constitution, the Australian Constitution, and the Canadian Constitution, have a federal government, and that's what most Europeans do not understand. The President of the United States did not want to become a king, and George Washington retired in 1796 because the states of the unions were still fighting amongst them each other between the North and the South. He only wanted to run for 1 term. But in order to keep the Union united, he served 1 more term. And his great retirement was in the farewell address, in which he said, "The new American Republic should avoid entangling alliances. This is the new world, and we are separate from the old world." And that idea was basic all the way down to World War I and in World War II, and that idea of the isolated continent slowly broke down.
Yeah, it foreshadowed the Monroe Doctrine, and he also, in his farewell address, warned against the spirit of party.
Well, that's another problem, which we'll get into, but let's talk about the Monroe Doctrine.
Right, the Monroe Doctrine, named after James Monroe, which was mostly the handiwork of John Quincy Adams.
Correct.
Who was James Monroe's Secretary of State. And what the Monroe Doctrine did was essentially it set up the United States policy that was going to continue all the way through, 150 years, really.
It worked until 1898. Now,
yeah.
in 1898, with the Spanish-American War, it broke down.
Right.
We got into
with
another
the McKinley
imperial war.
administration's imperialism. But the Monroe Doctrine basically said, in our hemisphere, in the Western Hemisphere, we will keep to ourselves, and this is America's, United States of America's purview, whereas the rest, the Eastern Hemisphere, that was left to their own devices over there. And there was a policy of non-interference in European affairs, basically.
Correct. Well, why did James Madison, who was a great constitutional lawyer, declare war in the War of 1812, which was a disaster because British...
James Madison.
Yeah, James Madison. Sorry about that. Anyway, James Madison declared war against the British Navy, which was very large, because he thought that Britain was involved in 1812 with Russia and didn't have enough navy to take care of the American colonies.
Right.
And it was based on a false assumption that the colonies, particularly the western colonies, Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, Vermont, the states that bordered Canada, could
Right.
go up and conquer Canada and make the Canadians the 14th colony.
Right.
That was based on a false assumption.
That
The
the
Canadians
British,
were happy under the Tory government.
Right. Yeah, it was kind of the last-ditch attempt to claim the Canadian territory as American to really make it a total continental power. And they thought that the British would be distracted and wouldn't invest in it. They thought the Canadians wouldn't fight to defend their territory. And it just turned into a series of really poor military actions on the part of the United States. Their plan was awful. They didn't have very good communication between they had 3 points of invasion along the Great Lakes up into New York.
Right.
And none of it, there was no coordination between, their points of attack. There was very poor communication, and it was just a very botched military exercise.
Well,
and they were wrong about the British, and the Canadians. The Canadians defended their homes, and the British came to defend their territory.
Right. And the great military hero was Andrew Jackson, who won the Battle of New Orleans.
Right.
How about the Battle of Lake Erie?
Yeah.
But what about it?
Admiral Perry, yes.
Yeah, that was a surprise, because the Americans did build what they call frigates on the lake long before.
Yeah.
And the British couldn't get them into the lake. So the Great Lakes were in the charge of the American Navy. That was the paradox.
Right.
Big Falls.
Yeah,
Niagara
the Niagara
Falls.
Falls, yeah.
Right.
And they're still up there. I grew up on Lake Erie, so I grew up not too far, about 40 miles from the Perry Monument, and yeah, so there's all sorts of monuments and historical markers and descriptions of the Battle of the Great Lakes during the War of 1812.
All right. So getting back...
Which didn't last, I should point out, it wasn't just in 1812, it was several years long. It started
Well,
in
it was 1812 to 1814.
Right.
And in 1814 you had the Treaty of Ghent,
Right.
which is in Belgium, but at that time was occupied by France.
And wasn't the Treaty of Ghent signed before the Battle of New Orleans? Or
Yeah, there's a time gap there.
Yeah, but they didn't know about that in New Orleans.
Well,
and
yeah.
so Jackson came in and he defeated the British, but it was technically after the war was over.
That's right.
But that didn't prevent him from
But that
becoming a
gave-
big hero.
That made him Andrew Jackson, the military man, and
Right.
he was the second military man who ever became president.
Right.
Washington.
They didn't know about it because it takes weeks.
Yeah.
To
at
go
that
across the
time, yeah,
Atlantic. Right.
Sailing
Yeah.
ships.
Right.
Okay. So getting back now to the Constitution, the United States federal Constitution had 13 Senate seats, and Article 1 gives the power to the Congress, more important than the presidency. And you have two houses. Each state gets 2 senators. The House of Representatives are based on the size of the states. Virginia had the 16 electoral votes and 16 seats in the House of Representatives. Population. And they were, New York and Pennsylvania were tied, and there were 10 electoral votes and 10 seats in those states. Massachusetts was very important as an intellectual state, but they only had 5 seats. Okay. So the Senate got 6-year terms. The House had 2 years staggered, and that kept the separation of powers so that it would avoid getting a king. And that's quite different from the French Revolution. And we'll go over here now. Separation of states. each state, 13 state legislatures, 13 governors. That was a balance of power between the states and the federal government. So sovereignty in the United States is divided, and the president cannot become a king without some difficulty, although he could become a dictator in Trump's administration, the way he talks. The failure is that the Washington government did not think in terms of party government. Washington was a general, and he said that the vice president would automatically become the president, and the secretary of state would automatically become the vice president. And he just didn't have his mind on the two-party system. But the British had developed the two-party system, the Whigs and the Tories in England, long before the colonies were ever established. And then the House of Burgesses in Virginia, they had two houses, and they had party government in the United States. So that was a kind of a weakness of General Washington. Well, anyway, Jefferson then was in a constant fight with Hamilton, because Hamilton was the conservative who wanted to balance the budget, and Jefferson was thinking of making the federal constitution democracy, as we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And he kept saying that can be expanded into a new democratic government. And he called his party the Republican Democrats. And then as time went on, it just became the Democratic Party when he retired. So that's how the...
Jefferson and Hamilton had a wide variety of things that
one
they
was
battled
on the right and the other was on the left.
Hamilton wanted a national bank that Jefferson opposed. Hamilton, with the repaying of state debts from the war, there's squabbles over that.
Well, they had a
Hamilton
national
supported
bank. The national bank
Hamilton
worked.
supported financial speculation that
Right.
that James Madison and Thomas Jefferson abhorred and found dangerous, and of
Right.
course it inevitably led to great crashes in wealth.
That's much way
and-
down the future.
Yeah.
Down the future. Down the future. But the Bank of the United States had a 20-year limit on it. And after 20 years, it had to be renewed. And then Jackson got into that. He was going to resist the renewal of that bank.
Right, Andrew Jackson was elected on the populist
Right.
wave and against the banks
Right.
and against that type of federalism.
Well, anyway,
28.
1828, right. Well, anyway, the basic philosophy of the American government, as designed by Jefferson, was based on John Locke, who said that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They derive their justice from life, liberty, self-evident from life, liberty, and the pursuit of property was the third one. But Jefferson changed that to happiness, because Jefferson thought that happiness was better than just landed estates. And he took all of his land and put it into books, and when he died, he donated his great book collection to the Library of Congress. So Jefferson was a deeper intellectual than the narrow-minded Hamilton, who was only thinking of his own term. Hamilton was opposed to Jefferson, but in the end he voted for Jefferson because he thought Aaron Burr was a crook, and he turned out to be a crook.
Yeah.
Funny election.
While he disagreed with with Jefferson on most everything, he ended up endorsing Jefferson over Burr because he saw Burr as a political opportunist.
And he was a conspiracy. He
Who
came down
didn't
to-
take at Blenner
Oh,
Hassett
New
Island.
Orleans.
Alleged conspiracy. He was never convicted.
And then Jefferson got a new vice president.
Right.
His name was Albert Gallatin. He was the first Swiss American to get a
Right.
post. And he believed in balancing the budget. He was a Calvinist, and he had a hard money policy. So neither party wanted to go in debt at that time. That debt business came much later. Okay. So Madison then 3 months after he had declared war, knew he made a mistake
Yeah.
because he saw that the militia were only interested in land. And his Secretary of Army was unprepared. They didn't have the money. So he made a quick deal. See, he sent a 5-man delegation. There were 5 Democrats, and they put John Quincy Adams there. And Jefferson said, well, John Quincy Adams is going to bail us out of this by signing this quick peace, the Treaty of Ghent. And that got, and everybody forgot the War of 1812. That was an imperial adventure that failed. So anyway, the 5th president, James Monroe, was an era of good feelings. The two-party system had kind of united after as you say, Monroe kind of went over to Jackson, and over to Madison, and they kind of had a reconciliation. The Federalists disappeared because they wouldn't expand the franchise. So then both parties started to go toward the popular vote. And John Quincy Adams had a one-party election for one term. He called himself a Republican Federalist or something like that. Mm-hmm. And then he decided to become a Whig and he retired from the House of Representatives in 1848 when he met Abraham Lincoln as a Whig. He was the only president who went back to the House of Representatives on the slavery question.
He basically died on the floor of the House.
Yeah, interesting, isn't it? So anyway, the 1824 election was a tie. And when it's a tie, according to the Constitution, the rivals would go to the House of Representatives and each state got one vote. Well, Henry Clay, who was a Democrat, a Southerner.
From
Kentucky, but he had all of the business on the Ohio River.
From Lexington,
with the North. Mm-hmm. So Kentucky looks to the north for commerce, and Tennessee, landlocked, looks to the south in New Orleans. So there was a basic conflict.
Because it's easier in Tennessee to take the Mississippi down.
Right.
Use the Mississippi
and then during the War of
whereas in Kentucky, you'd take the Ohio River.
Yeah, and then during the war, when Napoleon was bankrupt, Jefferson said, I want to buy New Orleans.
Right.
And Napoleon says, I'll sell you this. Instead of $10 million, you can have the whole Louisiana territory for $25. Well, Jefferson got the $25 million.
Yeah.
Went into debt for
it. I think that's an interesting illustration of Jefferson's
flexibility,
practical instincts, because in theory, an earlier Jefferson would have been philosophically opposed to the executive exerting that type of power, perhaps. But as a practical matter, when he was president, he saw this opportunity to more than double the size, the territory of the United States, and he certainly did so. While Jefferson did have a lot of philosophy, he was very practical in a lot of ways as well.
All right. Do we want to take a station break now? What time is it?
We can do that. It's close enough to time for a station break.
About the French Revolution?
We're going to get to that if we've got time.
I'm David DeWitt, and I'm here with Professor Bob Whaley, retired from Ohio University, and we are talking about the early United States and the early presidencies of Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, John Quincy Adams, and Andrew Jackson.
Okay.
And progressivism in that era, both in the United States and throughout the world at that time, most specifically in France.
Well, as I say, the American Revolution should be called the War of Independence because in France, you have a basic, deep revolution.
Right.
You have
and a messy and a bloody one.
Yeah, and you have a constitutional crisis, and you also have a religious crisis.
And you have a crisis of political systems, monarchies versus republicanism.
That's a constitutional.
And you have monarchists from Prussia and Austria invading France to fight the revolutionaries.
Napoleonic Wars.
Yeah.
So that was deep, and then the religious, see, the monarchy and the religion was all tied up.
Oh yeah.
You
Yeah.
see, so you have to have a religious revolution as well as a political revolution and a legal revolution.
Right, and I think you can trace, I mean, a lot of the American Revolution and subsequently the French Revolution to, I mean, do these things happen without the Reformation? I don't think so.
Well, it goes back to
I think they happen in the context of the Reformation, inevitably.
Well, the Reformation, from the point of view of the Protestants, was called a reform.
Well, right, and I think, well, I guess the point I'm making is that the Reformation in many ways leads to the Enlightenment era thinkers, which leads to the American and
but very,
French
very slowly.
revolutions. Oh, this is over centuries' time. Yes.
Well, you have to have science. Okay, now Martin Luther and John Calvin did not understand science. It was Sir Isaac Newton that brought a new philosophy of deism. And he raised the best question, see, they had this debate about what's the center of the universe, what's the center of man. Now, according to the old theology, man was the center, God created man as the center, and the sun and the stars and the moon, all the planetary bodies revolved about the earth. God and man, according to the Old Testament, was the center of all things, okay? Well, the astronomers looked up and they said, well, look, there are planets, and there's gravity, and Newton then figured out the law of gravity, and Galileo got in that from Italy, and they got telescopes, and they saw, oh, there are 5 planets up there. And then the telescope, well, the sun is not perfect. It's got sunspots, and the moon has pockmarks. So if God created these things, he made an awful, imperfect heavenly bodies, you see. Well, the Pope wouldn't look through the telescope. That was a famous thing. Galileo says, here's the telescope. Look through there. Will you look through that? Pope says, that's the devil. I'm not going to look through it. So then Galileo goes back to Florence and he writes a little essay, a debate between Simplico. Simplico and the other guy was the heliocentric.
Right.
The Pope says, I'm not Simplico. Come back here, confess.
Yeah.
He confessed 5 times.
Yeah.
But then he went back to Florence, and the Pope didn't have the army to get him because Italy was divided. They had a papal army, but Florence and Milan and
Yeah. You had the Papal States, but then
Yeah.
you had the other regions of
yeah,
Italy.
Venice. You had a little city.
Yeah, the
states.
Venetians,
Right.
yeah, Florence, and yeah.
So the Reformation
Kingdoms,
kind of
different kingdoms.
leads to
Naples down in the
questions
south.
of science, you see, because Newton was a Protestant, and it's doubtful that any Catholic would have ever thought of questioning science, you see. Well, that came through the Greeks. That came through Jefferson and his admiration of Greek democracy.
Right.
So Jefferson...
And not just Jefferson, most of those people
the
at
deals.
that time, yeah.
Yeah,
So Jefferson, Madison, Washington.
Right. So Jefferson was somewhat of an archaeologist. He went down and he saw the rocks, and he said, well, the Earth must be older than 6,000 years. It
Right.
must be at least 100,000. Well, now it's in the billions.
Right. And the one thing they could never figure out was why you could find seashells on the tops of mountains.
Yeah.
That was the one question they could never
Well, that
square.
took geology.
That
And it wasn't until 1795 that geology was the last of the sciences.
Yeah, it was much later that, and of course we know now because plate tectonics have pushed
Right,
those mountains
right,
up.
right.
They used to be underwater.
So first we had astronomy, then we had physics, then we had chemistry. Charles and Boyle's law,
Right.
pressure, and then we had oxygen. Oxygen was discovered at this time, and they burned sulfur and put a little glass bulb and said, well, fire is oxidization, and if you measure the air and the weight of the gas in there, there's a gas up there. It's not just air. It's not a vacuum. There's a substance up there. And that's how they discovered oxygen at this time. But it was a very slow discovery because of the resistance. Well, anyway, the French Revolution politically then started out with a constitutional monarchy. like the British. They invented the tricolor. No crosses. They got rid of the cross. Secular flag, like the United States. The United States had stars and stripes, no crosses on it. And the French with 3 stripes, red, white, and blue. White stood for the monarchy, blue stood for the city of Paris, and red stood for the people. That's why the red flag it meant originally danger. Well, then when the revolution went on, this guy downtown puts up the red flag, and he became a revolutionary against the earlier conservative government. And they executed the king. So they executed Louis the 16th.
King Louis the 16th.
Right.
And Marie Antoinette.
Right. Because she was a Habsburg and was
Right.
married to a foreign dictator, a
Right.
foreign monarch, okay? And that led to the war.
And that's also why Austria invaded.
That's
and,
right.
Her brother was the king of Austria.
And then Prussia was on the side, and Russia, they were also.
Right.
So England, Russia, Prussia, Spain, they were all trying to overthrow the French Revolution as a...
Right, and they didn't
democracy.
and they wanted to maintain their monarchical power.
Okay. But then after they got rid of the king, they had to have an executive. So they created this thing called the Committee of Public Safety.
Right.
12 revolutionaries. The most famous was Robespierre.
Maximilian Robespierre, yes.
Yeah, and then they had Saint-Just, and they had Danton, and they had a guy by the name of Thiers, who eventually became the chief of police under Napoleon. And the revolution went further and further to the left until it got to 1794. And the Reign of Terror is the high point. And these 12 people on the Committee of Safety said, we better get Robespierre because he's behind this, because if we don't get him, we're going to get caught.
Right.
So they changed the Constitution.
And this created a very interesting political
we
situation
have
back in the United
counter-revolution.
States.
It's more conservative from now on.
Yeah.
And they set up a 5-man directory, 5-man instead of 12. And then they put in a constitutional provision which said the 5 directors could not fire each other. They made it a republic, but the 5-man directory could not fire one another. So it was a stalemate. So then gives Napoleon the opportunity. The civilians were suspicious of this general, who came from Corsica, a French colony, but spoke the Italian language. He was Napoleon Bonaparte, okay? So he says, we'll send him down to Italy, and the Italians, he'll get bogged down in the complexity of the Italian balance of power. So he goes down there, and Napoleon puts all of his nephews and nieces, nepotism, on the thrones, and he makes satellite states all over Italy. Then he comes back in 1799, and he pulls off another revolution called the coup d'etat, the blow at the state, which is a very small revolution in which you get rid of one band of dictators and put in a new one. So Napoleon gets rid of the 5-man directory and sets up a 3-council government, and I am the first consul. And he put 2 others from the directory. And then he says, all right, I'm the only consul, and I'm going to go down to the Pope, down in Pope Pius the 7th. And he says to the Pope, you're going to crown me Emperor of the West. And Napoleon, being Napoleon, grabs the crown and puts it on his own head. I am the Emperor of the West, and the Holy Roman Empire is defunct.
Right.
Well, then the monarchs kept on fighting and went on and on and on. But you see, the Russians had men, and the Prussians had men, and the British had sea power. And the blockade gradually sinks in. And eventually, Napoleon is caught. He's arrested. He's put on the island of Elba. But then he escapes again. And he has the 100 days. And he goes back to Belgium, and they have the Battle of Waterloo. This time, the British take him down to the island of St. Helena, down in the middle of the Atlantic where he could never escape. And he wrote his memoirs and died of cancer. And that led to the myth, of Napoleon III.
Right, but he really fell down in Russia.
Yeah,
He tried
it
to
was
invade
too big,
Russia.
too big.
Boom, Russian winters.
He made the same mistake as Adolf Hitler.
Yep, Hitler made the same mistake.
Yeah, he got into Moscow very easily because he invaded in the summer. Okay, he got to Moscow, and there he is with all of his horses in November, and suddenly Moscow starts to burn down. And the Russians, with the snow, surrounded the whole city of Moscow. And Napoleon says, hey, we better retreat very fast, or we'll be frozen here. So he takes his whole army, and they take their loot, and they pick up crucifixes and gold, and they gradually retreat from Moscow in 1 month, and they get back to Leipzig in Germany, and they have the Battle of Leipzig, which is called the Battle of Nations, in which they all gang up against Napoleon, and the Austrians and the Prussians all changed sides, and Napoleon was lost and arrested and put in jail. Okay, so what was your question? We got off the tangent there. What date are we up to now, Lois?
Well, it was 1812 when they...
Okay, he was defeated in 1812, but he really lost the Battle of Nations in Leipzig, where all of his army defected. And the Prussians and the Russians went their own way. And then we have the peace treaty at the Congress of Vienna, in which the whole map of Europe was redesigned and was based on the balance of power. Now, France didn't lose any territory. They made a big France. The French territory was the same in 1815 as it was, even bigger than it was when it started. This made France a stable conservative power, and they restored the Bourbon monarchy. So the balance of power was designed by Metternich and Castlereagh of Britain, and this was called the Metternich system. The Bourbon monarchy was restored, and that's the end of the French Revolution as far as they thought. But in 1830, there was another little revolution, the Revolution of 1830.
Right.
It was a very small revolution. It was led by Louis Philippe, who was an aristocrat. And he said, I am the king of the French, not the French state, but I am the king of the French. That gets back to the people. And I have a conservative revolution, Louis Philippe, and we get rid of the Bourbons.
But weren't there more revolutions?
Yeah, 1848. 1848.
Which is the one that Les Mis is set in.
Yeah, well, that was the most decisive one. In 1848, Metternich was overthrown, and that led to revolution in 50 cities in Europe. Berlin, Venice. 1848 was the big revolution.
But wasn't there another one in
1870. Well, let's take about 1848. That's more important than 1870.
Well, let's make sure we...
All right, let's get 1848, and we'll get to 1870. If we don't get to 1870, I want to get the importance of 1848.
Which is what?
Revolution broke out in France, and then immediately followed in Berlin, in Rome, in Hungary. There were 50 cities throughout Europe that went into revolution. And somebody said when the French sneeze, the Europeans catch a cold. So Metternich lost his regime forever. But the Austrian Empire came back, and the Austrian Habsburg monarchy came back in 1850. Now, the Germans had a fight. They wanted nationalism. The problem with the Germans was, well, who's going to be the chief executive? And they met in Frankfurt, and they had a long debate. It's called the Frankfurt Parliament. Well, the Habsburg wanted to be it, and the Hohenzollern wanted to be it. Well, they started fighting and debating over who would be the chief executive, and the Frankfurt Parliament was closed down, and the old regime was restored, even though Metternich personally was gone. And then Napoleon the third comes in, and he runs as president. He called himself President Napoleon, and he won the election because 90% of the voters thought that this was Napoleon the First.
Mhm.
Who is Napoleon? So they voted for Napoleon as a president, and he stayed as president for a year and a half. And then after a year and a half, he said, well, I am Emperor Napoleon III. The second died as a prince and never reigned, okay? But he took that legitimacy of the third. So we had 5 republics eventually,
5 republics, 5 French republics.
and eventually became 7 with de Gaulle. And we had 2 empires, and the French were always debating with the Constitution. Do we want a strong executive or a weak executive? And that debate continued right on down to Charles de Gaulle. And Charles de Gaulle was the most conservative counter-revolutionary that France has ever seen, in which he made a 7-year term. And then he used the technique of gerrymandering. He made a big circle around Paris, and he sent out spokes of the wheel.
But by then, we're in the 20th century.
Yeah, the French Revolution went through stages from 1789 to 1830 to 1848. Now, you wanted to get to 1870. What happened in 1870?
1870.
1870 was the Franco-Prussian War.
Franco-Prussian War. But let's get on to the 20th century. It was the Fourth Republic that ended
The 20th
in
century.
the Second World War. wasn't
Yeah,
it?
the Third Republic was ended when Hitler invaded
Third
Paris.
Republic.
And the Fourth Republic, they had the same constitution. The Fourth Republic was the Third Republic renamed. And they had the weak executive.
But then came de Gaulle.
All right, de Gaulle was in the expeditionary force of the American and British Army and rode into Paris on the back of a tank because he had developed the Free French. 2 minutes left. Well, de Gaulle then retired and said, I don't want to be the president of the Fourth Republic. And we had a coup in Algeria, and that brought de Gaulle to power. And I guess we'll have to stop at this point. Let's summarize.
With the Fifth Republic.
Yeah.
So we've been talking today about the American War for Independence and the French Revolution and France's various iterations over a century of trying to establish a republican form of government over the monarchists and the struggles that they went through. Obviously, I think we can conclude that progress is slow and arduous and never constant.
It's a circle that's like a roller coaster. I think it goes basically up, but there are dips.
There are dips, highs and lows. So as always, one of the best ways to keep progress moving forward is through debate. And as you always say, debate is the oxygen of democracy.
Let's keep the debate going.
We'll keep it going. Thank you, Professor.
Good.